Hi, I'm Jeff Nyquist, and welcome to another edition of Friends and Enemies. I'm in the United States. My co host, Alex Benesch, is in Germany. And today we're going to talk about global warming, the global warming special operation, which is a disinformation and active measure by the Russians. Um, Everybody is told that there's a scientific consensus, as if science actually operates on a consensus. Science is about the discovery of individual scientists that upset everything everybody knows. And Al Gore makes it sound like all the respectable scientists believe in global warming, have believed in it for the last 30 years. That's not true. Just to go through a few of the celebrated scientists that uh, have gone against global warming narrative, just a few of them who are called by Al Gore and by Obama deniers. I'll just go through the list. Dr. Edward Wegman, former chairman of the Committee on Applied and Theoretical Statistics of the National Academy of Sciences. He has demolished the famous hockey stick graph that launched the global warming panic. Dr. David Bromwich, president of the International Commission on Polar Meteorology, says, quote, "It's hard to see a global warming signal from the mainland of Antarctica right now," unquote. Professor Paul Ryder, chief of insects and infectious disease at the famed Pasteur Institute, says, quote, "No major scientist with any long record in his field accepts Al Gore's claim that global warming spreads mosquito-borne diseases." Professor Hendrik Tenekes, director of research, Royal Netherlands Meteorological Institute, states, quote, "There exists no sound theoretical framework for climate predictability studies used for global warming forecasts." Dr. Christopher Lancy, past chairman of the American Meteorological Society's Committee on Tropical Meteorology and Tropical Cyclones, says, quote, "There are no known scientific studies that show a conclusive physical link between global warming and observed hurricane frequency and intensity." Dr. Antonio Ziccici, one of the world's most foremost physicists, former president of the European Physical Society, who discovered nuclear antimatter, calls global warming models, quote, "incoherent and invalid." Dr. Zbigniew Zavarovsky, world-renowned expert on the ancient ice cores used in climate research, says the UN, quote, "based its global warming hypothesis on arbitrary assumptions, and these assumptions, it is now clear, are false." Professor Freeman Dyson, a lot of people probably know him, he's one of the world's most eminent physicists, says the models used to justify global warming alarmism, quote, "do not begin to describe the real world that we live in," unquote. So this is just a sampling of scientists that are like, no, no, global warming is not scientific. And we know where it comes from, and we'll get into that. So, Alex, you've done some research this week on the beginnings of this whole thing. Maybe you can explain it for us.
All right. Well, here it goes. People should be aware that climate research, obviously related to weather research, this was all created initially for realistic purposes. With realistic expectations. So, for example, besides your obvious weather report and some better understanding of the climate. And there was also the demands of the military. Now, if people know anything about the military, it is highly, highly dependent on the weather and accurate weather forecasts. No matter where it's the Army, it's the Air Force, it's the Navy. You're planning an operation in this part of the world and that part of the world. I mean, people can tell currently with the war that's going on in Ukraine how important weather truly is. Are your soldiers freezing to death, like the Russians, because they don't have adequate clothing? Is the ground frozen, or is it mud? Can you use your tanks? Do you have any additional problems? Or when the Nazis tried to invade Russia, they of course had a massive problem with the weather, when it became incredibly cold. And not just did the humans give out, the humans couldn't operate under these temperatures, but also the equipment couldn't function under these circumstances. So this is why the military is highly interested in understanding weather, making weather forecasts, and also understanding the climate in specific areas of operation or potential operation. So because sometimes, people get this misunderstanding that climate research is, that climate research was sort of politicized from the beginning or weird from the beginning, when it was anything but. Another famous example was the invasion of Normandy, codenamed Operation Overlord, in 1944. So the Anglo-Americans needed reasonably acceptable weather for over 150,000 troops, 7,000 boats, and fighter aircraft. Weather experts had been analyzing for months when the weather would most likely be suitable on the coast, and even at the last moment, it was the meteorologists who convinced the U.S. General Eisenhower to postpone the attack by 1 day to June 6th because of an approaching weather front. Only at low tide would one be able to see from a safe distance what defenses the Nazis had installed in the water. There couldn't be too much wind or waves so that the infantrymen could storm the coast from the boats, and Anglo-American Air Force divisions needed moonlight to see targets for bombardment and to dispatch paratroopers. If the deadline had been cancelled due to the approaching storm, the next opportunity would not have come until weeks later, and during this time, the German defensive measures could theoretically have advanced to such an extent that the Americans would then have failed in their attempted invasion. And so there was a whole backstory to the invasion of Normandy, by the way. So the Germans, they tried to get the most weather data. They had special boats, special airplanes, special everything. The British tried to counter that. The Americans tried to counter that. Everybody wanted to get the best weather data to make the best predictions. Now, famously, Generalfeldmarschall Rommel, the famous tank commander, Rommel was supposed to secure the coast, and at some point they sent the relevant officers home because they thought there was going to be bad weather for 2 weeks. No invasion was going to happen, but the British and the Americans had the better understanding of weather.
Yeah, on June 5th, the day before the invasion in 1944, it was pouring down rain. And they thought the storm was so intense and it was going to continue that Rommel went back to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday.
Yeah.
A lot of officers from 7th Army, Rommel commanded 7th Army, which was the army that was right by Normandy. And of course, he had charge of the whole coast as well, preparing it. But he had gone home. A lot of officers were given furlough to go to Paris. And I read the memoir of one of the officers, the commander of one of the regiments in the Panzer Lehr division. It was what do they call it? They called it a Panzer Grenadier regiment. His memoir, and he famously wrote this memoir. In his account of the battle, I guess he wasn't too interested in Paris. He came back a little early, came back in the early hours of the morning of the attack, or that later that night. And so he was there on the scene, and Rommel was not. And it was complete confusion on the German side without the high command, without Rommel and a lot of those guys that knew what the plan was, because Rommel had a plan for responding to an invasion right when it was beginning to start. And instead, the Allies, particularly the British, which is where this guy's division was stationed, were able to capture certain bridges and establish certain positions, which really threw the Germans back. So that by the time the Germans attacked, counterattacked, it was the wrong time, the wrong place, and the Allies were able to use heavy cruiser guns to drive the German attack back. So the Germans weren't able to push the Allies into the sea. It was too late. And so that critical weather made a big difference.
Yeah. So back then, it was not a bunch of politicized weirdos, working on crazy, creepy software that's like an oracle that's gonna predict the future. It was very, very different back then. So you had scientists back then. You had a clear purpose, what they were supposed to be doing, and they had realistic expectations of what they could do at that time. Now, the next step, obviously, so the next steps are important in order to understand when it all went weird, it all went sideways, and kind of the whole problem really started with climate research. So initially, the highest ranking meteorologist involved in the planning of D-Day was Britain's Captain James Stagg, and so he gave the strong recommendation he made the recommendation to attempt the invasion on June 6th. And in gratitude, he received some of the highest medals in the British colonial empire and became a member of the elite scientific association Royal Society, which is very important when it comes to climate research. So, yeah, the Allies managed to land 155,000 troops by nightfall, so on and so forth. And then, then came the whole next step in this saga. So, British meteorologist Captain James Stagg was also rewarded by the Americans with the Military Legion of Merit Medal for his accurate weather forecast for D-Day. He became president of the Royal Meteorological Society. Later in his career, served as director of the British Meteorological Office, which later housed the United Nations Climate Change Panel's IPCC working group and the highly influential Hadley Center for Climate Prediction and Research. So from 2001 onwards, the IPCC working group moved to the American Atmospheric and Oceanic Agency, NOAA. The Meteorological Office in Britain, also known simply as the UK Met Office, used some of the most powerful supercomputers in the world to calculate the weather, starting in the 60s. They used Ferranti's, then Cray's, IBM's, and NEC supercomputers. So today, the Met Office has 3 Cray XC40s with a total of 460,000 processor cores. Sounds really, really impressive. So the Met Office became part of the Air Ministry, administrating the Royal Air Force, so on and so forth. So this was all kind of in those kind of hands you would imagine it to be. This was very, very much conservative run. It was very military run. And so this went on for a while, especially the first 5 directors of the UK Met Office were all fellows of the Royal Society, and they were knighted for their services to the empire. And this is how the trust was built in climate science. And this is why so many people later fell for the deception, because they couldn't imagine that an apparatus that was built that way by these people, that this apparatus would then be taken over by politicized operatives, right? This is where the trust comes from. Climate science climate science wasn't created in the 2000s. It is much, much older than that. So
and of course the whole use of climate science as a sabotage mechanism against the Western economies by claiming that burning fossil fuels are going to destroy the planet is a way to panic Western elites into abandoning the use of fossil fuels, which has been, for example, in your country, in Germany, extremely damaging to Germany.
Oh yeah. Well, it kind of it wants to change everything. It wants to just change anything about anything, right? And so the real problems began around 1999 with the hockey stick study, and then in the 2000s with these IPCC reports. Now, many people assumed this was trustworthy because of the long history of climate research. But then you got some, people like this This was Sir John Theodore Houghton, co-chair of the IPCC Working Group on Climate Change, lead author of the first three major IPCC assessment reports, shared the Nobel Peace Prize with Al Gore, and he's the founder and honorary scientist of the Hadley Center for Climate Predictions and Research. He became a Knight, Fellow of the Royal Society, and President of the Royal Meteorological Society. Okay, how did this go so wrong, right? Now, he's the guy, this Houghton is the guy who said the following, and I quote, "If we want good environmental policy in the future, we have to have a catastrophe. It's like safety on public transport. People only act when there has been an accident." So this was a direct statement from him in the Sunday Telegraph. You know, sometimes people used a different abbreviated quote, but then people found the original. So you need a catastrophe, otherwise people won't listen. And so he became kind of the guy. He was, as I mentioned, running or dominating the Hadley Center for Climate Predictions. And Britain is sort of the place where the most important software is used. You know, with the Met Office. This is kind of the computer program that claims to simulate the world, simulate the future. You can calculate what the future is going to be like, and it's so accurate, down to a fraction of a degree Celsius. It's supposed to be perfection, right? Even though the active scientists all talk about problems and challenges, especially with accuracy. So they're claiming...
And there's accuracy. The challenges are in accuracy of measurement, because the measuring stations for measuring the temperature around the world, a lot of them are near cities, which are heat sources. And cities have grown up around others of them. So they're not randomly placed outside cities to get an accurate temperature reading. And many of them, disproportionate number of them, are in places in the former Soviet Union, believe it or not. So I think there's a problem there. Of course, I think that the climate was warming in the 80s and the 90s, in the early 2000s, but that was due to the sun, to solar activity, the solar cycles 2022 and 23. And now we're in solar cycle 25, and it's a bit awkward to look at what the climate is doing, because it seems to be there was a dearth of sunspot activity and a solar cooling in the first part of the 25th cycle. In fact, I think they broke records in terms of the lack of sunspot activity. Now we're in the middle of the cycle, so there's a lot of sunspot activity as there is in the middle. But I think the prediction has been from solar scientists, because they study the sun, that it's going to get much colder now after we pass the middle of the 25th solar cycle, and then the next one's going to get colder. And that's because the sun's electromagnetic field is weakening with each of these solar cycles. It started with 24, it's going to go on into 25. And this is where you get into the work of Svensmark, the Danish scientist, that says that the electromagnetic field of the sun is critical for cloud formation, because when that electromagnetic field goes down, there's more clouds generated, because there's more cosmic rays striking the oceans, making clouds. His theory has been validated by other scientists in Switzerland and Denmark, that that this increased cloud formation creates more clouds around the world, creates more rainfall, of course, and some initial cooling, and some initial heating, I should say, rather, because the clouds keep warmth in them. But then there is a cooling as these clouds release their energy and as they reflect sunlight from the sun back out into space. So, and this may be the mechanism, some feel, of ice ages, that the sun, when it loses its electromagnetic field for decades at a time, you'll set up this situation with there's heavy snowfall and slow gradual, initial heating, but then slow gradual cooling over a longer period. And this seems to be the cycle we're in, which is what makes this whole thing so dangerous. So tell me, Alex, do you believe this idea that there's a consensus in science, or that they just put over this hoax on all the other scientists?
Well, the the often quoted consensus studies are utter garbage, and I have a whole chapter on those in my book. And I mean, that point has been made before, but it's a crucial one. So some people listen to a politician or they read an article in a major newspaper, right? So the politician says, or the journalist says, well, almost 100%, almost all scientists, climate scientists, agree with the IPCC report or the general IPCC view on climate change, right? So it sounds like only a tiny fraction of scientists has doubts, and then these tiny little groups of scientists, they must work for the oil conspiracy or the right-wing
Right.
global
And you
conspiracy, right?
notice that the search engines like Google, if you went to find out the words of scientists that oppose it, you can't find them on the Google search engine.
Yeah, you gotta
They
get books.
blotted them out.
You have to get
The
books, yeah.
leading climate scientists in Canada, for example, several years ago came forward and says, look, this is a nonsense. They're imposing global warming as an ideology on the schools. They're wrecking people's careers. This is wrong. This stuff is nonsense. It's not scientific. And I used to be able to tap in, global, opponents of global warming or whatever, and I would get things like that. And now I can't even find the Canadian news story where it talked
Mm,
about this guy giving an interview saying this is
true.
garbage, and they're
Yeah.
trying to terrorize scientists into accepting it.
And so there was so when you hear quotes like this from a politician, it was Obama or it was the London Guardian, any sort of major politician or major newspaper, when they say something like this, there's almost a total consensus. They are referring to specific consensus studies, which are garbage, and most of the time, these people quoting that, they've never even read these terrible consensus studies, or they have not fully read them with the addendum material attached to it. So there have been some real studies done. This was a German expert on this a long time ago, and he sent out these questionnaires, detailed questionnaires, to selected relevant climate scientists, and they were supposed to say how much on a scale from this to that do you trust these computer models, these computer programs simulating the future. And so this is how a proper study was done, and these relevant scientists, and they,
So they were
they,
looking at the model. They were looking at
well,
the
they're
computer
giving,
models.
this was specific selected scientists giving their specific opinions. How much do you trust this? How much do you trust that accuracy? How much trust do you have in these computer models? And the trust in these computer simulations was not great. It was
Well,
below
and
average.
they're not great, because if you go back and you look at the IPCC's climate predictions over the last decade and a half, they've been way off. They haven't predicted the climate and the weather at all. And I cite David Bromwich, who is the head of the Polar Meteorology Group of the Byrd Polar Research Center in Antarctica, and this is what he says. He says no aspect of the doomsday case came in for so much criticism as the immensely complex and comprehensive computer models with which the IPCC and others claim to be able to predict climate change hundreds of years into the future. And he says the case for man made catastrophic global warming overwhelmingly depends on these models. That's really all it depends on. And what is interesting to me about this is that if you go back and you read the New York Times about these models, they will tell you these models, the math in these models, came from the nuclear winter math. And what these ignoramuses don't realize, and you could read Sergei Tretyakhov's book, um, well, it's about him, Comrade J. He talks about how this was an operation of the KGB. That nuclear winter was a KGB operation sponsored by Gorbachev, and one of the Russian scientists who created this math that now global warming is based on, which was the math saying that nuclear winter would happen if you set off so many nuclear bombs. He actually went to American authorities when he was in the West and said, look, Andropov put us up to this. This is completely phony. He was kidnapped then by the KGB in a conference in Madrid in 1985. But it's completely bogus, and anybody can look this up and see
Yeah.
that what I'm saying, these are commonly known facts, but nobody
So
knows these facts.
so once you make a real study, once you send out detailed questionnaires to relevant climate scientists, when you do a proper study like this, the result that comes back is we don't really trust these computer simulations. These simulations are they're just not good, right? So, but the dominant, mostly quoted consensus studies were made in a completely different way. So, for example, this widely reported study by Mr. Crook in 2013, that's really his name, by the way, by Mr. Cook, he's called Mr. Cook in 2013 in a publication, Environmental Research Letters, was reported to have shown that 97% of scientists agreed with the IPCC's view on global warming. The evaluation of 12,000 scientific papers on global warming and global climate change between 1991 and 2011 revealed this, supposedly. After 6 years, the study had already been downloaded over 1 million times. A number of other very similar studies have since appeared. So this is supposed to settle the issue, but it doesn't. Mr. Cook was actually a cartoonist and website creator. He earned a degree in physics, but then gave up his academic career to become self-employed with cartoons and HTML websites. His degree was a bachelor's degree, which taught the basics. So,
bachelor's degree in physics is not much.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like this is
if
kind of
his, ever known a
this
physicist,
is his
will
background.
Tell you.
No, but because he did this very flawed consensus study, right? Because he became an activist and created this consensus study, he was rewarded with new academic titles. For example, he received a PhD in cognitive science, whatever that's supposed to be, from the University of Western Australia.
PhD. Yeah.
From the University of Western Australia, it was about the topic of his blog, namely how people think about climate change. So this is how you get a doctorate now. This is how you get a PhD now, right? If you just become an activist. So you can hand out these degrees to Greta Thunberg. You can hand them out to anybody who will say these things. Now, Cook developed an online course for the University of Queensland on climate change denial that has already had 25,000 students enrolled. So a whole division of soldiers is being trained here for the war against CO2 emissions.
That's two divisions of soldiers, 25,000.
So let's look at the study that became so famous. The study is called Quantifying the Consensus on Anthropogenic Global Warming in the Scientific Literature by John Cook from 2013. So right at the beginning, we learned that 12,000 scientific publications were not actually examined, but only the very short summaries that contained terms such as global warming. So this is a big problem because these short summaries, they're only a few sentences. So they weren't even looking at these studies. They were just looking at these short excerpts. And it's like, and so this is how they've done it. They looked in. They used a database with a search function. They had a search field. There were thousands and thousands of studies in this database, and they typed in the search words, the search terms, global climate change. And so the result then says 12,000 studies in some shape or form mention global climate change. These studies are not necessarily about climate change. They may not be relevant to climate change. They just mention it. So these were the search results. And then they went through these search results, and then they determined, is this study or excerpt from the study, is it against the IPCC view, or is it for the IPCC view, or is it neutral? That's how they did it, which is absolutely ridiculous. And so they basically counted everything as a yes. So only if an excerpt of a study only if this short excerpt explicitly said, we don't believe in the IPCC consensus, only then it would count as a no. So this is kind of the
Yeah, and it
crazy way
show
that we're
you
counting it.
the yeah, to explain this, how inaccurate people say, well, the model's accurate or whatever because it feels like it's getting warmer. And it is, I think there are some really warm years we've had. But of course, it's not. It's the middle of the solar cycle, so it's a warm year. Those are always the warm years. But going back to David Bromwich, who was the polar meteorology group of the Byrd Polar Research Center in Antarctica, and he's a professor of atmospheric sciences. He did his own. He was specialized in his own predictions, and he absolutely thought that the IPCC models and the global warming models were trash, the ones that were used by the global warming doomsayers. He thought they were trash. Now, it comes down to prediction. Who is really good at predicting? Well, Bromwich famously saved another scientist in Antarctica because of his predictions. There was a scientist trapped in the winter in Antarctica, which has high winds and horrible storms. You can't really fly planes. He had a pancreatic infection, this scientist, and he was going to die if they couldn't get him to a hospital. And Bromwich used his model, his climate model, to predict when there would be a window in which a very brave aircrew could dare to fly across Antarctica, pick this guy up, and get him out so that he could get medical attention. And it was exact. That window opened, that plane went in, rescued that scientist, got out. And that's Bromwich, who, by the way, they would destroy him. They would attack Bromwich as a climate denier. But he had the accurate prediction. He said their models are trash. His model worked to save a man's life. So that's you put your money where your mouth is, or you save a life or you don't. And
Yeah.
of course, this is
Well,
what it's all about: hard science versus this muck, this nonsense.
here's some funny math magic here, okay? So this is from the Cook study, right? So they just went through a database, looked for anything that said global warming in some shape or form, and then they had 12,000 search results, right? So then they said this: we find that 66.4% of the abstracts, short excerpts, expressed no position on man-made global warming. 32.6% confirmed warning, 0.7% denied it, and 0.3% were uncertain about the cause of global warming. Of the briefs, excerpts, that did express a position on warming, 97.1 supported the consensus positions that humans are causing global warming. So they started with 12,000 results, didn't even look at the studies, just at the excerpts. And of these 12,000, they basically removed 8,000 because they made no real statement about global warming, not confirming, not saying it's garbage. So they were tossing 2/3 of everything, and then what was left, they counted everything as a yes. But it doesn't tell you if that study is really good about global warming, or if the study even is mainly about global warming. It doesn't say the author of the study is relevant to global warming. It was just counted as a yes, and that's how they came up with the magic 97% number. Oh, everybody is on board. Of course,
It's just made up. Yeah,
and
it's like communist propaganda. It's the big lie. They put over the big lie. And the thing is that they will attack people like Bromwich, people like Svensmark in Denmark, people like Kirby in Sweden. They will attack these scientists and call them cranks, solar theory cranks, a lot of them. And the fact of the matter is their science, their experiments are proved out. They've actually developed new scientific understandings of weather, cloud formation, and how things work. And these other people, where is the scientific discovery? Where is the new understandings of climate or solar activity from the global warming crowd?
yeah.
Zero. They haven't made any contribution. All their predictions are wrong again and again. It's just political propaganda. It's like the communist disinformation network, has infiltrated science, turning science into a weapon against society.
Yeah, so this is like how they played it, and it's really highly unusual in this day and age in science that somebody would get away with something like this.
Yeah.
So this is not how you do it. So um,
And they do get away with it.
yeah, and so a lot of these. So if you find relevant studies, they have a very complex opinion. Relevant studies have a complex opinion on climate change, and they're careful in their wording, and they're not just saying yes, we believe anything the IPCC does. And it's very strange that starting about in 1999 with the hockey stick, and then in the 2000s, that this global warming movement already became so powerful and so aggressive, even though back then, as scientists admitted back then, even though back then these prediction software programs were absolute trash. There was a study that I quoted in my book. There was an article in Nature magazine where they talked about the Hadley Center, the supposed best software. And they said that, well, it's like this. Initially, the programs were so primitive, they wouldn't even simulate oceans. So an ocean was just an ocean-sized puddle. It was about a foot deep. They didn't understand the oceans properly, so they just treated the oceans like a shallow puddle. Then they didn't understand how vegetation really worked. So in the earlier versions of the software, vegetation was just a green texture, slapped over the earth, like in a terrible video game from, 30 years ago. It was just a green sort of texture. Then they tried to understand and program the effect on animals and different types of plants and ebb and flow. And anytime they would introduce a new element into the software, the results were just catastrophic. The results of the simulation didn't make any sense. So they had to shape and reshape and just manipulate the software a bunch of times. And
Yeah,
then
big
they claim,
dishonesty.
yeah, but still, you have to imagine that so many different fields of science have to feed information to that software, into that software. So there's all these complex fields of science. Everybody is drowning in data. They can't really estimate their own margins of error. Everybody is overworked. Everybody really is out of their depth. And then supposedly these flawed elements are then assembled in a perfect way. They're treated as perfect, and then they're assembled supposedly in a perfect way, translated in a perfect way into computer code, into computer language, to make the perfect software that can
It's just such
predict us the
nonsense.
future.
The myth of dangerous human-caused climate change is centered on the idea that greenhouse gases are what cause the planet to heat up, that it traps the heat in a kind of vicious cycle that the planet continues to heat up. But high CO2 levels are not new, and we don't really have high. In fact, carbon dioxide levels during the recent past are very low by the standards of earlier geological history. So why didn't the Earth overheat and become like Venus, become this boiling cauldron with super hot temperatures, 10,000, 25, 30,000 years ago when you had higher levels of CO2 in the atmosphere? Or in the period of the dinosaurs where there was more CO2 than there is now. You have planetary carbon dioxide levels have declined from around 1,000 ppm in the early Cenozoic, 60 million years ago, consistently. And of course, I think it's because the sun is, of course, getting old. It's aging. And this is why I think we're in the middle of an ice age. We're in a what's called a interglacial period within a 2 million year ice age, because the sun has not been putting out its electromagnetic field has not been as strong, and so CO2 levels have fluctuated in the past, and they're weakening now, and they can show through tree ring data that when the Earth's electromagnetic field is weaker, and they can calculate that by there's different ways of calculating it. One is by the way the gravity of all the planets affects the core of the sun. And they look at the tree ring data. It is directly correlated how warm it is, because that's what tree ring data tells people, how warm it is versus the cosmic rays reaching the oceans. Getting through the sun's electromagnetic field blocks out cosmic rays. So the stronger it is, the less cosmic rays. Well, it turns out that it's what they call cosmic ray flux that is more important in these temperature things than CO2. CO2 is just almost a nothing. It's a blip. In fact, many scientists will say that the CO2, that this recent rise in CO2, which is very slight, is actually not causing global warming. It's actually an effect of the global warming caused by the sun and its electromagnetic field weakening or strengthening over the 80s and the 90s. So these scientific questions are all ignored by these fanatics, by these global warming doomsayers. But it's political. It's communism, because they want to show that capitalism is destroying the planet, because capitalism has got these cheap forms of fossil fuel, which allows our modern lifestyle where we're able to live without backbreaking labor and dying at the age of 50 like everybody did 120, 30 years ago. That this made human life a lot better. They want to eliminate that. They want the backbreaking labor. They want us living. What are we going to do? Run horses? These Chinese electric vehicles aren't going to work because they get their electricity from coal burning, power plants. See, they can't, and they don't want nuclear power. So what are they doing? They're deindustrializing us when we got 8 billion people to take care of. It's insane.
Right. So there's people who will say, and this is all rehearsed because the entire climate debate has been broken down into these pre-prepared statements. So this is how people are trained. This is how these books are being constructed. So you program a generation of people into thinking a certain way, so they believe they always have the right answer. They can always respond with a pre-packaged answer. And one of these pre-prepared answers is, well, the climate models, the simulation software programs, they're getting better all the time because the resolution gets better, right? Because they break down the world into these little blocks, like in the Minecraft game, and so the blocks are getting smaller. So that means it's better, right? But how do you determine what's really accurate and what's not? Because we don't have a time machine. We can fly into the future and measure everything and then come back and say, yeah, it's like this or it's like that. So the only real way to estimate the only real way to judge these computer programs is these computer programs. So this is a terrible, terrible problem. And when you look at studies, and people can make this experiment themselves, right? So you go to a search engine and you type in search terms. You're looking for a study on cloud research, ocean research, anything to do with climate, and you're looking for the additional search term problems or challenges. And that's when you get a bunch of relevant studies from leading active climate scientists. Like, for example, with the Oceans and the Argo program, right? And these scientists will tell you we have all kinds of problems, especially problems that affect accuracy. And if you just have one field of climate science, that's not good enough. Like, for example, the ocean research. If the ocean research is not good enough, that alone will throw off the final computer simulation. So the results will be not accurate because one element feeding into it is not good enough. And imagine if every field is not perfect, good enough.
There's a very easy way to parse this for the audience. For if you want to judge this for yourself, people can look this up. And I I have a sort of a side interest in astronomy, always been curious. So Astronomy magazine back in 1998, when they were having this record heat in the summer of '98, um, you had Astronomy magazine. Its front cover was about, and I could never find this issue again, but I wish I had bought it. I saw it at the bookstore in the magazine rack. It was all the planets are warmer. It isn't just the Earth that's warmer. All the planets in the solar system are warmer because the sun was putting out more heat in 1998. Maybe it was 99. It was one of those years. I think it was 98 because that was the hot year. They had really record heat, for example, in Texas. They had a lot of, I think they had like 160 people die from the heat in Texas in the summer of 98. So I really found that interesting. And what's interesting is that Lawrence Solomon, in his book on the climate denial, he has a whole chapter on the fact that Mars has been getting warmer as you track the 1980s and 90s and early 2000s with the Earth getting warmer. They're tracking the ice cap on Mars has been shrinking. Mars has been registering, also temperature warming on Mars. Well, why would Mars be getting warmer? They're not driving SUVs on Mars, right? They're not
Yeah.
using carbon dioxide on Mars. No, it's because the sun is causing it both on the Earth. It makes sense. The Earth's getting warmer. The sun is putting out more heat.
Yeah, and
It's
space
putting out more
space
heat
is
on Mars too. Yeah.
space is hilariously complicated, right? So this is like there's so many aspects to the sun and space and gravitational and the cycling, right? There's so many things that get into this. It's really really complicated, but people don't like complicated, right? They like a simple gimmicky explanation. Well, it's the CO2, and CO2 is the industry. So if we destroy the industry, we solve the problem. No, it's a very, very complex problem. And it's like this gimmick that's been created. So let's say, for example, we look at the ocean research, right? Because if the ocean research is not good enough, the final simulation is not good enough. If they can't get the oceans right, how heat is absorbed, what's really going on in the
Yes.
ocean, if they get the oceans wrong, they get everything wrong with the final
And and
software.
it and if you've got agents of the Kremlin who have infiltrated science, who are pushing this, threatening people's careers, getting hold of money like agent networks do, that would explain how this thing has gotten pushed so that people are intimidated. They're literally intimidated by a false set of theories with shabby sets of research, with dishonest reporting on it. You could only the communist movement and the communist infiltration could even begin to push this successfully as they have. And another element here is the registering of temperatures. Now that we entered the 25th solar cycle in around 2020, and the fact that it was when we entered that we had record low sunspot activity, which is a measurement of the amount of heat put out by the Earth, but by the sun and its electromagnetic field strength. You had in October of 2022, you had the CNN meteorologist Alison Chinchar wrote a piece titled "Antarctica's Last 6 Months Were the Coldest on Record." That was the title of the piece. Now, I'm sure if you went to go search that, the search engine might not allow you to find it. But last February, as if to paint an entirely different picture, um, it wasn't last February, it was February of 2022. The Scientific American offered the headline "Sea Ice Around Antarctica Reaches a Record Low." And this, they claimed, was due to a combination of factors. But the article was misleading the readers by suggesting that the Antarctic is warming. And that's not the case. The ice flows around Antarctica are from warming because the Antarctica ice sheet is like 2 miles thick. And what happens is along the edges, when it gets warm, these pieces break off and fall in and make the ice flows. So basically, when you have colder temperatures in Antarctica, you're going to have less of these pieces breaking off, forming these ice flows. So they didn't actually, Scientific American left out by omission what the real cause of this, the larger ice flows around the Antarctica was. that it was actually it depended on warming for them to be created to begin with. And of course, in at the Vostok station, which is the Russian station, in April of 2022, on April 14th of that year, they recorded 106.2 degrees, negative 106.2 degrees Fahrenheit, which I think was the lowest temperature ever recorded in Antarctica, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe there's been a lower one since. But these record-breaking cold temperature recordings suggest, again, it's not global warming that we're headed into, it's actually global cooling, which is very dangerous when you've got 8 million people who need to be fed, and they're being fed because of these last warmer 3 decades where you've been able to grow a lot of crops in Russia, for example, in Canada, where you're able to feed all these people in the third world. Suddenly, that's going to be taken away as we move from the 25th to the 26th solar cycle.
So it is said that most of the warming will be absorbed by the oceans. Aha, so what do we know about the oceans? For a long time, buoys measured only surface temperatures. Then it became 15 meters deep, and at some point, the deep sea as well. But overall, far too few buoys are used, even though they're cheap, which is really strange. So at 166 million square kilometers, the Pacific Ocean is by far the largest sea in the world. Using only 3,000 buoys makes one buoy per 55,000 square kilometers, approximately the size of the country of Croatia. And we're not talking about a shallow body of water. We're not talking about a two-dimensional plane. We're talking about a three-dimensional ocean several kilometers deep, and it gets really, really cold. So, strangely little money is spent on these buoys, and I quote from a relevant study here. It was said that the cost of satellite tracking per day is about $10, which becomes quite expensive for continuous year-long orbits. To reduce costs, some drifters were programmed to transmit only every 3 days. Once every 3 days, or only 1/3 of the time of the day. This creates gaps in the trajectories that need to be interpolated. So you have these very few buoys, and they're just drifting through the ocean. And sometimes they send a signal. And this is supposed to be an accurate representation of all the different temperatures that are going on in the oceans, right? Because at some point over there, it's a bit warmer, but over there, it's significantly colder. Which of these two events is this buoy going to pick up by accident, right? So this is kind of the problem. And it says that so the deeper you want to measure, the more expensive the devices become. The deep sea, meaning everything below a few hundred meters, usually has temperatures close to the freezing point, and the deep sea makes up around 90% of the water in the oceans. The famous Argo program, which is the most relevant program, the Argo program has 4,000 measuring devices, most of which measure at a depth of 1,000 meters. That wouldn't sound too bad if it weren't for the fact that the experts complain about serious deficiencies. The system, which is already based on cost-efficient, cheap technology, suffers from, quote, relatively flat financing. One would like to improve coverage in critical regions, such as the equatorial band, where higher measurement resolution is required, and the western border regions, where mesoscale noise is high. This is a polite way of saying that too little measurement is being carried out, especially in important ocean regions, due to a significant lack of funding. These buoys cost a few $1,000s each, depending on the quality level and the amount of sensors, which means that thousands more buoys could be purchased for tens of millions of dollars to improve coverage, to get closer to the truth. What's happening with all this heat energy that ends up in the oceans? Is it really changing the oceans, or is it not? We are expected to bet trillions of dollars on climate computer models. We're supposed to gamble our future, gamble trillions of dollars. But when it comes to obtaining data from the oceans, these people skimp. They skimp on a few $1,000,000. So why haven't these rich people, these prominent rich people that supposedly care so much about climate change, why haven't these rich people combined together provided $100 million for new buoys? So the ocean researchers provided with data by the Argo project demand that Argo work with our end user community, meaning the researchers, to improve the use of Argo data in forecasting systems and services. So people are dissatisfied with the way they are treated by the Argo leadership and how Argo has so far ignored the researchers' input. So it's amazing how that works, right? It says in a relevant study here, only a small fraction of the funding needed to support the ambitious community requests for an expanded Argo program can currently be identified. Small fraction. It is important for Argo to meet its future challenges as a single integrated program. 50% of the water volume lies below a certain ocean depth, and this is exactly where substantial variability of temperatures occur. Changes in deep ocean heat content were estimated, they talk about uncertainties due to the sparse observations, and these uncertainties affect about 2/3 of the magnitude of the signal. Now, this is a polite way of saying the Argo program is completely underfunded. We have very little idea about the temperatures really in the oceans. This is the actual reality of climate science, right? So they can, they can do certain things with these buoys. They kind of have a rough idea about things. But to get a precise idea, they would need a lot more of these buoys, which are not that expensive to begin with. But somebody is making the decision, or has been making the decision, we do not really want to understand the ocean. We really do not want to accurately measure. And this is only one problem of many problems that are very much like this one. So people probably remember that when they go swimming in the ocean or they go swimming in a lake. Sometimes the water seems kind of warm, but a few meters away, it's really cold. Or you take a little dive and suddenly the water becomes really cold. Now, this problem is also persistent in the oceans. And if you don't measure it right, if you measure at the wrong points, if you don't measure enough, you don't really have much of an idea about what was going on. The deficiencies are so significant that the climate process team on ocean mixing had a lively discussion about them. There are doubts about previous computer models for predictions regarding these oceans. And it goes on like this. This is also from a study. The underlying assumptions of these methods are uncertain and may be most unreliable, where suspected turbulence in the water is greatest. The assumptions of these methods are known to prove incorrect near boundaries, with discrepancies between parameterizations and direct measurements of up to a factor of 10. A deviation of a factor of 10. An extra 0. So this is kind of what's going on, and the core Argo program relies almost entirely on seabird electronics sensors for temperature measurements. And there are complaints about these sensors as well. So and these mistakes, they accumulate, they multiply, they get multiplied. If you combine different problematic fields of science, if you create this master computer software program, these mistakes, these individual mistakes and uncertainties and margins of error, they will multiply. And then this throws off the result of the calculation. Now, this is kind of the core of the problem, and you can find that in almost every aspect of climate science. The temperature measurements, the satellites measuring the rising of the oceans. There's problems everywhere, but beginning in roughly about 1999, some people, some circles became hyper aggressive about the hockey stick study, about this whole issue, even when the final software was laughably bad. When they couldn't really simulate the oceans at all, they couldn't simulate the vegetation. Immediately, initially, it became a fanatical push, a fanatical drive. So, yeah, I have some extensive notes on the hockey stick, which I call the holy hockey stick, because that's like the Quran of the climate change movement. This is kind of everything to them. So this is kind of one example of how these mistakes are made or these uncertainties exist in climate science. Yet you are supposed to believe in a cult of certainty. Like this, they can exactly predict the temperature in the future in relation to how much CO2 we're emitting. And this is why we have to make these kind of changes by that kind of a date. Otherwise, it's going to be so bad for us. I mean, this is...
Yeah, and scientists don't really understand the interactions of the electromagnetic field of the Earth and the sun, for example. They know they're related. You had something called the Carrington event that happened in 1859, which was a giant solar flare that melted telegraph lines and pooled up metals and stuff in telegraph systems. If we were to have a Carrington event now, that Carrington event would wipe out most of our electronic infrastructure across the planet. But they think that these things happen like once every couple of centuries. They have a Carrington event. Well, what's interesting is that there's in ancient Egyptian records recorded by Solon and related by Plato, there was a super Carrington event that I think was referred to by the ancient Egyptian priests to Solon, which a scientist more recently, by looking at was it ice cores or something like that, he found that there had been a super Carrington event, something 400 times stronger than the Carrington event had happened at the end of the last ice age, might have caused the end of the ice age by melting all the ice all at once. You had this massive intensive heat from the sun, so hot they believed that it fused rocks on the moon. One of the things the Apollo missions did is they went to the moon actually suspecting this event had happened to find these fused rocks, see if there was evidence that the sun had scorched the moon, because the moon doesn't have an atmosphere. Obviously, this heat would be... Well, what these ancient Egyptian priests said is that up at higher altitudes where there's less atmosphere, people were burned by the sun. They were killed by it. It was so intense that you had to be in the lowlands, and you probably had to take cover because of this heat that came from the sun, this intensive heat. It's fascinating. We don't know, these lost records and lost, ideas of lost civilizations. There was something that existed a long time ago that we see reflected in some passages in surviving ancient writings, and some of these old stone buildings that they don't know the age, like Professor Schock saying the Sphinx is much older than the pyramids, for example, and was made probably before Egypt came into existence as a kingdom in the 3rd millennium BC, but or 4th millennium BC. So all of these things about climate and electromagnetic fields of the sun and earth, we just don't understand those. We don't understand whether and we're little ants on the surface of the earth. We think we're influencing climate. when these hiccups from the sun or the earth now, where its electromagnetic field is weakening so that the north and south magnetic poles are drifting away from north and south, which has been accelerating in recent decades, which is a disturbing phenomenon. We've never seen this happen in human history. And of course, scientists are watching this going, what does this mean? What is going to happen? And of course, I think what a lot of it means is more muons, more cosmic rays are going to reach those oceans. And again, another indication of cooling is coming, not heating. And I think the critical thing for me as a person who's looking at this strategically is that Russia and China, if you watch their scientific conferences, if you look at the things their scientists say, particularly the Russian scientists from the St. Petersburg observatory, they are saying it's cooling, and they're saying we've got decades of cooling ahead. And of course, nobody makes a big deal about this. Putin actually gave a press conference in which someone asked him if he believed in global warming, and he kind of gave that creepy smile he gives, and he says, no, I believe in global cooling. I don't believe in global warming, because that's what the Russian scientists are saying to their leadership. And this for Russia is major, and for China, because how is China going to feed itself if a cooling cycle happens? If all that food that's grown by Russia now in Canada and Scandinavian countries in the far north, much bigger harvests, if those harvests aren't available with 8 billion people, what happens? See, and this is, you talk about weather with the Battle of Normandy being critical to political or military decisions. Knowledge that the earth is going to get cooler, that the food supply is going to shrink, is got to be super
Highly relevant.
critical as a grand strategic fact and factor, right?
Yeah, and it's
That's
like,
got to be.
in all war, I mean, all war is based on deception. You always want to deceive the opponent about where you're going to attack, how you are going to attack, how much stuff you bring, how much soldiers you bring. And so this is, deception is obviously necessary for war. And when it comes to climate and weather data, climate and weather science, obviously other actors, state and non-state actors in the world, they want to deceive us regarding weather data. And this is kind of a thing that you have to expect, right? And what the world climate was like 300 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 10,000, 100 years ago, what the climate was like in the past is only an estimate. And the past climate is estimated using so-called proxy data, which sounds scientific, but it's just a polite way of saying poor substitute for real data. So we get these ice cores and tree rings, corals, sediments in water, pine cones, and some written records where people describe the weather or how cold it is. So in 2009, Stephen McIntyre and Ross McKittrick published a harsh criticism of the methods of notorious hockey stick researchers such as Michael Mann in the publication called Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America. Quote, contrary to assurances, source code from Mann et al. Not so they criticize these they criticize the methods used by Mann, and they say everything that happened before about the year 1800 could not be reconstructed as precisely as Mann and his research partners claimed. With Mann's methodology, hockey stick shaped temperature statistics can even be obtained from a data background from a background noise data. So you can turn anything into a hockey stick, like these guys did, and say, look, there was no warming or almost no warming, and then suddenly all this warming happened because of industry. So you can just artificially create these results in a study. In 1995, a paper by Soroshian and Douglas G. Martinson at the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine stated that research into proxy data was still in an embryonic stage. Just 4 years later, researchers like Mann presented the hockey stick based on proxy data. So, you can create a flood of data, by analyzing ice cores and tree rings and corals and pine cones, but then you drown in this data and you can't really estimate how accurate it is. This data overwhelms the individual researcher. And so mountains of data are managed and processed using controversial mathematical methods and fed into questionable computer software programs. So tree ring data, for example, is supposed to show a cold phase from the year 1550 onwards, and things of that nature. So this is how they explain these things. So proxy data is not real data. It is not always clear whether the signal they record reflects only local conditions or is representative of regional or global conditions. The accuracy is often unknown or untested. They often reflect more than one variable, making interpretation difficult, and the absolute and even relative timing of the data set is often not certain. Dating is achieved by techniques which are of limited accuracy, limiting the degree of comparability. Researchers Diaz and Bradley provide a discussion of a number of potential sources of uncertainty and bias associated with the reconstruction of climate variables. Even tree ring data have been compared using increasingly complicated methods, additional data, and replacement data. So you can always obfuscate the uncertainty by adding more data and saying, well, according to our calculations, this is what the data shows, but this is not accuracy, and there's no way to really be sure. So sometimes you work with proxy data to judge other proxy data, pieces of data. So this is endless amounts of stuff.
Techniques. Yeah, these are just all dishonest techniques. I thought I would mention in the book Red Cocaine by Joseph D. Douglas Jr., which is based on defector testimony from Jan Shana. He talks about one aspect of the Kremlin's long-range strategy, which is the third step is to get into of this long-range strategy is, well, I'll go through all the steps. The first is to build up the cadres throughout the world, communists who will carry out in networks the strategy. And the second step is the training of terrorists and the training for international terrorism, which began as fighters for liberation. National liberation was the term coined at the time. And the third step was international drug and narcotics trafficking. The fourth step was to infiltrate organized crime and to create their own organized crime networks. And the fifth step was to plan and prepare for sabotage throughout the whole world. And what I would suggest is that the sabotage is the pre-war phase when they start actively sabotaging. And it's not just, cyber warfare. Sabotage would be sending millions of refugees from the third world across the American border or into Germany, right? Creating networks that will using criminal networks and cartels, drug cartels, to move millions of people into first world countries, disrupting their economies, creating crime waves, emptying jails in Venezuela, for example, or Nicaragua and the Congo, communist countries, and sending all those criminals into the U.S. These are among the sabotage operations, but global warming, I believe, is perhaps the most significant sabotage operation because it aims at our petroleum industry and our fossil fuel industries to try to discredit them. And then in the search for these alternatives, we end up buying Chinese electric cars that spontaneously catch fire, that rely on batteries that you need. Chinese have cornered the market on like lithium. They've created all these mines so that we become dependent on China for our transportation. And all it's all the usual suspects. These leftist politicians who really want socialism here in America are the ones going along with this, pushing it. People like Al Gore, people like Biden, these are people put into office by Armand Hammer, for example, who was a KGB agent. If you read Edward J. Epstein's Hammer file, these are the people pushing it, the people on the left. In Europe, And you can maybe testify this for Germany. Look at the Green Party, look at Scholz and the Social Democrats. And here in America, the Democratic Party, which really was taken over by the communist movement, a couple decades ago, more than that. The Clintons got elected. I think they were part of it. Obama got elected. He's a part of it. Biden's part of it. Al Gore was part of it. So it's part of the infiltration and sabotaging of the West, active sabotage. And people have to wake up to this, because if they let this go over them and, oh, yeah, we have to go along with that. No, the problem is you're going to find yourself in a cold home with the power shut off, with you not having enough, with your gas rationed, with you're
Yeah.
losing your job and no money in the banks because they're collapsing. This is what you're going to
Yeah,
end
it's
up
like
with.
people, I mean, people's, or at least most people, have gotten wise about gambling, right? People understand that gambling is just a little stupid fun activity, and it usually goes very wrong. The system is designed so you lose money, right? Now, there's still some
And
people
the
who
house
gamble.
wins.
There's still
Yeah,
some
the house
people who
wins.
believe in gambling, and they will get into debt, and they will bet everything they have, and they often will lose everything they have. But most people understand that gambling is stupid, right? They look at the numbers, or they look at the probability of success, and then they estimate that it's not worth the risk, right? So one person out of millions may get lucky, but everybody else doesn't get lucky. And I mentioned this in my book quite a few times. We are expected to gamble, to bet so much money and so much production and so much substance. We're supposed to gamble this on a piece of software, on that prediction made by that piece of software. What happens if the software is wrong? What happens if it's not correct? We are wasting an incredible amount of money and wealth and production capabilities. We compromise our safety, we compromise our security. So this is why people have to always make a risk assessment when they go with a plan, right? Because the left is selling climate change. The left is selling it as a win-win-win situation. So look at Greta Thunberg. She's saying, well, if we save the climate, we also simultaneously rid the world of evil imperialism and evil capitalism. It's a win-win-win. It cannot go wrong. You can only just win. It's a no-brainer. But what are the actual risks? This is also a losing game. If you get it wrong, you suffer the consequences. You lose all that money, you lose all that production, you lose all these jobs, all that substance that a society truly needs. So basically, these supercomputers that are used for, especially those in Britain, where the most important bit of software is running on, these monolithic computers, they're almost like a crazy oracle. Like an oracle made of stone blocks thousands of years ago. And there are these shamans who work the oracle, or they're part of this oracle, and they predict the future. And people actually did this in the ancient world. They would read the tea leaves, so to speak. They would go to these oracles and do these rituals in order to gain an advantage of predicting the future. What battles should we fight? Should we bet our military on this battle or the other battle? Should we attack now? Should we attack later? So the fate of an empire sometimes would rest on silly predictions made by these oracles, or by rituals, doing a ritual and then getting a result and then basing your decisions on that result. And we're expected to do that, right? I mean, I like science. I like science when it provably does what it's supposed to do. You have a satellite that can look at the vegetation. A satellite can look at the icebergs and make sure how big they are. But the same satellite can also track Soviet or Russian military installations. They can estimate down to a fraction of an inch. They can estimate the size of an enemy warship or an enemy installation. So science is great, but when it turns into this silly type of an oracle, and the left is saying this oracle is confirming Marxism, because Marx's predictions were wrong. Because Marx was saying that this capitalism can only lead to evil. Industrial capitalism can only be bad, right? And making profits and being able to make profits, being able to trade, that can only have an evil, terrible, horrible result. That was his prediction. And on that prediction, this entire socialist movement was created. They were betting everything, really betting their lives. These Russian peasants joining the Red Army, they were all betting their future on this oracle named Karl Marx and his predictions. But then, of course, the prediction was wrong. Industrial capitalism can be awesome. It can do awesome things for a large
it produced a better standard of living for the people in America and Western Europe. Yeah.
So this is why the left loves this climate prediction oracle, these computer supercomputers. They love it because it sort of seems to confirm that Marx was truly right. So that capitalism,
for environmental reasons.
Yeah. So they say, well, they now say that industrial capitalism can work for a while, but it will ultimately destroy the earth. It will destroy the climate and the earth. So finally, Marx has been proven right. This is basically what they're saying. So in order to destroy or to save the climate, we need to destroy industry or change industry, let the Chinese make the batteries for our cars. This is how we can save the world. And of course, these leftists will claim, well, by saving the climate, we can also get rid of capitalism and individual rights and individual freedoms. And so it makes perfect sense for them. So they went with one oracle, Marx, and now they go with Marx and these supercomputers running these stupid pieces of software. This is the magic oracle. And I said this before on the show. It's so hideously, ridiculously, comically complicated to understand the Earth and space and how it interacts and what we do with the planet. It's so complicated, but they dumb it down to this one gimmick of CO2. This one stupid gimmick that everybody can remember. It's a gas, and we shouldn't emit this gas. And by not emitting this gas, we solve the problem. This is how it's sold. Marketing is always very simple, but once you buy into it, then it becomes complicated again. Oh, we're going to destroy that industry. We're going to destroy those jobs, and we're going to outsource this, and we're going to change your life this way. Now everything's getting more expensive. It's easy to fall into this trap and say there's a consensus and it all looks so scientific. Well, it was built by real scientists. It was initially created by real scientists, but then came, the crazies, the assets, the operatives, putting the software on top of everything and combining these fields that were not really, these fields that serve different purposes. You want to understand the ocean? Okay, that's good for shipping and that's good for the United States Navy. You want to understand clouds and storms? That's good for weather reports. That's good for the U.S. Air Force. There's individual fields with realistic expectations, realistic goals that you can check a few months later or a year later. And you can say it was accurate or was not accurate. But then combining all these things into a crazy bit of software and turning it into an oracle, that's exactly what has been done. And sometimes people don't understand how you can insert manipulations, manipulate the final software, and that does not mean that every climate scientist is knowingly part of some grand conspiracy. Because I hear these arguments all the time. How can climate change be wrong if tens of thousands of scientists work on this stuff and they work on climate science? How can they all be wrong? How can they all be part of a conspiracy? That wouldn't work. Yeah, well, that's not how manipulation is done. That's not how you do it. I mean, these people, these scientists, they're drowning in data. They cannot really estimate their own problems properly, let alone everybody else's problems and the compounded problems of creating the software.
Yeah. I should say now we've covered this topic pretty good, but I got some information about the Ukraine war today that I thought was pretty interesting that I wanted to share with the listeners. And it has to do with how Ukraine has managed this successful offensive that's captured more than 1,000 square kilometers of Russian territory, the Ukrainians in their invasion of the Kursk Oblast in Russia. It is electronic warfare successes. They have created holes in the Russian surveillance system where they were able to mass the troops and do the attack without being detected. They also have gotten air dominance over the battlefield with the new F-16s, but this air dominance was achieved because of a stupidity of the Russians. Apparently, I knew that the Ukrainians were using HIMARS to strike surface-to-air missile batteries, but the Russians themselves were destroying their own anti-aircraft system by using anti-aircraft missiles as surface-to-surface missiles and using them up. And I guess the right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing, but they used up too many of them. And the Russian anti-aircraft system has now holes in it. And with the use of jamming and the use of drones, the Ukrainians have developed drones that can go after helicopters. And by using longer range HIMARS to hit trains, forcing the Russians to rely on helicopters to forward move supplies, the drones are now hitting the helicopters. So there's this chain reaction of things, ingenious little innovations that the Ukrainians have mastered, especially with some of the new things that have been given to them by the British, by the United States and other countries, that have allowed them to completely hamstring the Russians. The Russians now are in such a crisis, and they've lost so many troops in all of this. There are 700 Russian troops trapped in a sort of not a box canyon, but it's like a cul-de-sac in Kursk. And the Russians, they're caught between these rivers where the bridges are knocked out. And these troops are probably going to have to surrender. The Russians are so desperate, they're pulling troops from Kaliningrad, which is clear on the Baltic between Poland and Lithuania. It's a little salient of Russian territory. They're moving troops out of there to come back to defend. And the Russian front lines are coming apart all up and down the front. There's a paralysis setting in, so that it might be that the Ukrainians can strike at Crimea, because the Russians have pulled their air units out of Crimea. They've had air bases heavily struck in Russia. 700 of these glide bombs were destroyed in an air attack on an air base. These are glide bombs they were using on Kharkiv. The Russians call Kharkov, which is I think it's the second largest city in Ukraine after Kiev that is been bombed with these glide bombs. The Russian Air Force is not able to function. They've shot down a Russian bomber. I think the F-16s might have done that. The F-16s are flying over Russian territory, right along that border area, to prevent what the Russians were doing to defend their territory. Was they didn't have a large army stationed there. They had their border troops and whatever lighter armed troops. They were using fuel air bombs or vacuum bombs dropped out of heavy bombers or out of the back of transport planes, because these fuel air bombs are big. And the minute that, like in the Belgorod area, when the Ukrainians would advance a little bit, they drop one of these right on the Ukrainian troops. And of course, it would be reported that they dropped it in Ukraine. They were really dropping them in Russia. And the Ukrainians had reason to keep this secret. The Russians had a reason to keep it secret because You drop one of those bombs, they're like a small nuclear weapon, only they're not nuclear. It's a fuel air bomb, it's a vacuum bomb. It creates a shock wave similar to that of a 5 to 10 kiloton weapon. Very, very destructive weapons. And so the consequence is that since they lost control of the air, they can't drop these fuel air bombs on the Ukrainians, so they can't stop their advance. And that just sort of initiated part of the breakdown of the Russian system of defense. And of course, with the breakdown of their logistical network, because the Ukrainians have been hitting trains, again, as I said, that means the artillery ammunition, they have way more of it than the Ukrainians. They can't get it forward to the artillery units. Now, they don't dare. And so the Russians are taking these heavy casualties. This next to a British study showing that maybe as many as 600,000 Russian troops have been killed in the war so far, not to mention 200,000 to 400,000 wounded. So this Russia is really taking it on the chin right now. And of course, 2 years ago this month, excuse me, the same Ukrainian general that engineered that victory has engineered this. They have taken more Russian territory now in the last 10 days than the Russians have taken in the last 8 months. And they continue to advance. So I just thought I'd give that as a report. And of course, this talk from Russia about using nuclear weapons is coming from this. And the Chinese are very disgruntled about these Russian failures. They're very unhappy about it because they expected Russia was their strong ally. Russia's proving to be very weak. And this weakness is not because the Russians don't have the troops or the equipment. Their organization, their intelligence, their leadership, they're not
terrible.
innovating. They're not keeping up. It's sloppy. The Russian leadership just doesn't have attention to detail because it's so top down. They don't give initiative to any people below. And of course, they've got the Ukrainians mulled out. They've got spies everywhere, but the Ukrainians were able to maintain intelligent security about this operation and preparing it because it must have been prepared for many weeks in advance of this strike. And so we don't know where this is headed, but it looks like Russia may have to make peace, and maybe they'll have to give back. If they want their territory back, they'll have to give territory back to the Ukrainians. That's some speculation. Or they have to decide on a nuclear strikes and risk the world finding out maybe their nuclear weapons don't work, which I'm not so sure about that, but it's possible given the level of corruption and the stealing of armament, procurement money for new armaments and new weapons, all these new weapons that Russia has been developing for the last 25 years since the Second Chechen War, where they tested a lot of the prototypes in the Second Chechen War. These weapons, they've only built very small numbers of them. They don't work exactly the way they're supposed to, like the Armata tank, and they don't dare use them. They're keeping them in reserve because they're the only good stuff they've got. They're using all this obsolete stuff, the stuff they've taken out of mothballs from the Cold War. Tanks that Gorbachev bragged he destroyed, that they just stored, the 10,000 tanks. This is what they're using, and the artillery and whatnot, and the ammunition. So I think there's a real crisis developing. And what I had a source in Russia was telling me that if things went awry for them, the Russians had planned this massive cyber attack on the U.S. East Coast. Who knows whether they can actually affect that or not? I don't know. I was thinking they would do this when the U.S. first started giving help to Ukraine back in the first year of the war, but they have not. And we will see now with what's happened now whether the U.S. is going to get hit with the cyber attack or problems in Germany and so on.
There's some really there's some options that the Russians have that people rarely ever talk about, right? People talk about the conventional warfare. They talk about obviously all these other types of warfare, but in terms of larger scale deceptions, one of the things I'm concerned about is getting rid of Vladimir Putin and pretending that this is a major change in Russia. So this is something that we should look out for, because Putin's health hasn't been that good, and everybody's pinned the war on him. So by getting rid of him, the Russians could play this theater of a reset in international relations. They can pin it all on him and say, there's so many people that didn't want this in Russia, so many powerful people that try to stop him, or they were too afraid to stop him. But now he's gone. And now everything's different. So they may actually try to fool the world again. Give back Crimea, give back some other territories, and then as an exchange, again, sell gas and oil to the West, get in that money, and try to rebuild for the next attempt in combination with China and North Korea.
Learning from their mistakes, which they have done some of.
And there's also another deception that they could play, which is something that I was mentioning when the Prigozhin little coup attempt happened. When the Wagner commander, when he Prigozhin,
the former Kremlin caterer Prigozhin.
Yeah, when he basically announced that he was going to make his own decisions. He would go against the Kremlin. He would go against Putin. He was very radical, and he may even have intended to march on Moscow in some shape or form.
He did actually send a column of
and there was concern. There was some unconfirmed rumors that he was about to acquire some nuclear weapons and storage, or some other weapons of mass destruction. Now, when that happened, I warned the audience that the Russians may actually stage that kind of thing in a larger way. So, for example, let's assume the Russians go downhill even more. The war is going terrible for them. The Russian industry can't keep up. The demographics are terrible. So what Russia may do is they may pretend to split into parts. It could be 2 parts, could be 3 parts, could be 4 parts. And then some parts are supposedly more radical than these others. Now, one of these supposed independent or new pieces of Russia, one of these parts of Russia, they may actually choose to use nuclear or biological chemical weapons against Ukraine. And these other parts of Russia, these other broken up parts of Russia, may then claim they were not part of that decision, that this was a rogue piece of Russia that was doing these terrible things. And this is something that I think has always been an option, because for a long time, Russia received a lot of appeasement from the West by using that fear of Russia breaking apart. That really became a big thing after 1991, when the Russians demanded more money, more appeasement, more Western markets, more of everything, because the alternative, they said, was Russia breaks into different pieces, and some of these pieces may be communist again, or ultra right-wing, or just plain crazy, and they have nuclear weapons. So the West doesn't want that, so give us appeasement and money. And so they may actually signal that threat again by having some palace coup, and nobody knows where Putin is, and the whole world is, holding its breath, wondering what's going to happen next. And I'm really concerned that Russia pretends to break apart. One of these parts may actually have a deeper alliance or open alliance with China, because China needs the space, China needs resources, and Russia needs people. So this is how they can do things and have no accountability. They will not take responsibility of what they actually do, because they say, we have broken into pieces.
Yeah, that's it. they try to scare people with the idea that if Russia breaks up, it's going to be worse in terms of nuclear weapons. But you've got basically a maniac in Putin already with a large nuclear arsenal. What could be worse? It's already bad. And of course, helping every other terrorist and communist regime on the planet aligned with him. Anyway,
Or they can,
this,
or maybe a
yeah,
last thing here. Maybe they use North Korea as a joker card. They
sure.
make North Korea start something else, so the whole world is focused on that. And this is maybe how the Russians can get a better deal with Ukraine by saying, if
Yeah.
the Russians can claim we intervene with North Korea, and as a thank you, we get a better deal with Ukraine, right? So it
Well, the
sounds like
Russians
a
are
quid
clearly
pro
doing
quo.
that with Iran right now. They're trying
Oh yeah,
to cause Russia's just sending equipment down to Iran to help them out in this dispute with Israel, although Iran does not seem to have the wherewithal. And as I said, I think last week, I don't think Iran is going to be effective. I think there's enough people in their country that hate the regime. They don't dare get involved in a major war because that could cause the unraveling of the regime. So very interesting. We will see what happens in the future. And Alex, I want to thank you for your presentation on the global warming. People can see that global warming is just such a joke. It's such a hoax, and people shouldn't believe in it. The book that I that was quoting from today was Lawrence Solomon's The Deniers. If people want to find it, it's out of print, and I think it's hard to find these things. But this was a journalist. Solomon did a series of articles on scientists that were denying global warming, saying this is garbage. And he thought, oh, I have enough for 6 columns, 6 scientists. Turns out he found 100 major
yeah.
scientists that were saying that it was false. So if people are interested in looking at that resource, they should look that up. So I want to thank everybody for listening, and I'm Jeff Nyquist. This has been Friends and Enemies with myself and Alex Benesch. I'm in the U.S., Alex is in Germany, and I hope you'll join us next week for another edition.